The summer of 1881 sat heavy on the land along Rio Bonito. Not the kind of heavy that passes with a cloud, the kind that settles into the dirt and stays there, baking the earth until the riverbank cracked and the cattle stood in the shade with their heads low, too tired to even swat flies. Tobias Morrow had been working that same stretch of fence since sunup. 55 years old, broad as a barn door, moving the way a big man moves when the heat has already won the argument. He had a silver belly hat pulled low, a yellow bandana dark with sweat, and a wagon wheel that needed 2 new spokes before he could call the morning done. It was the kind of work that asks nothing of you but your back and your patience. But something was wrong. The cattle would not go to the water. A dozen heads stood 20 yards from the bank, shifting and snorting, refusing to walk down to the river the way they had every summer before. Tobias noticed. He always noticed. 30 years of tracking, first as a Texas Ranger, then as a man who had learned the hard way that the land tells you things if you stop talking long enough to hear it. His old horse was pulling at the lead rope, nostrils wide, aimed at the willow brush along the bank. Then he saw the boot prints in the mud. Army boots, standard issue. And someone had dragged a branch across them. Not well enough to erase them, just well enough to make it look like they had tried. 3 ravens were circling a flat rock near the water. On top of that rock, spread out like a man trying to hide something in plain sight, was a buckskin shirt. Tobias walked toward it. He was 3 steps away when a young Apache woman crawled out from behind a rotting log. Her shoulder was soaked through with blood. Her eyes were not asking for water. They were not asking for help. She was staring at that shirt on the rock, and her voice was shaking when she said the words. "Please, don't look under it." Tobias stopped. Now here is the question that should stay with you all the way to the end of this story. When a wounded woman in the middle of the New Mexico wilderness begs a stranger not to look at something, is she trying to protect herself, or is she trying to protect someone else? Tobias Morrow had lived long enough to know that when someone tells you not to look at something, that something is exactly what you need to see. He looked. He grabbed the edge of that buckskin shirt and lifted it. Underneath was a small bundle wrapped tight with rawhide cord. He undid it slow, the way a man handles something he is not sure will bite him. Inside were 4 things. A hand-drawn map of the Rio Bonito bend, right where he was standing. A woman's bracelet, beaded and broken, like it had been torn from someone's wrist. A torn piece of military scout cloth with a marking stitched into the corner, and a folded paper bearing the official stamp of the marshal's office. Elena lunged forward and grabbed his arm. "You don't understand what you are holding." He looked at the scout cloth again. The marking on it belonged to a name he would learn in about 30 seconds. Daco Ashwoman, Apache Scout, United States Army. Her brother. Now here's where this story gets interesting, and I want you to stay with me because this part matters. Looking at that bundle cold, any lawman in Lincoln County would have drawn the same conclusion. A scout's insignia at a crime scene. An official document linking the location to something darker. It looked like a man had been there. It looked like that man had done something he should not have done. That was exactly the point. Elena was shaking, not from the blood loss, though that was not helping. She was shaking because she knew how it looked. She had known since the moment Quillen's men shot her, and she grabbed that bundle and ran. Deputy Marshal Rafe Quillen had put it together, piece by piece. He wanted the Mescalero families off this bend of the river. Good water, good grass, worth a fortune to the right cattle outfit. When some of those families refused to put their marks on Quillen's water right papers, they disappeared. Elena had seen where they went. She had seen the shallow mounds along the bank, barely covered, like someone had been in a hurry. So Quillen did what corrupt men have always done when they need a leash. He built a frame. He planted Daco's markings at the scene. He filed a report saying Elena had murdered a deputy and fled. And now Daco, her own brother, was out there reading tracts and following orders, believing every word of it. She was not hiding that bundle from Tobias to protect herself. She was hiding it to protect the man who was hunting her. And that man was already closer than either of them knew. What Tobias did not know yet was worse. The man hunting Elena was not just following her tracks. He was following the lie Quillen had built for him. Think about what it means to protect someone who does not even know they need protecting. That was what Elena was doing out there, wounded, alone, with nothing but that bundle and the last of her strength. If you appreciate stories about loyalty, buried truth, and men who still know right from wrong, subscribe and stay with us. This one is just getting started. Tobias did not fully believe her. Not yet. He had been around long enough to know that everybody running from something has half the truth in their mouth and the other half buried somewhere they hope you never find. But that map was real. Those boot prints being swept away was real. And the way those cattle had refused to walk to the water, well, cattle do not lie. He got Elena onto his wagon and drove back to the ranch without another word. But Tobias kept looking over his shoulder. Not because he was afraid of being followed, because deep down, he already knew they were. He cleaned the wound best he could, packed it with cloth, and told her to stay low and stay quiet. She did not argue. Whatever stubbornness lived in that woman, she was smart enough to know when she had used up her options. Then the dust came up from the direction of Fort Stanton. Tobias saw it from the window. A column of riders, soldiers, and riding out front, Deputy Marshal Rafe Quillen, straight-backed and unhurried, the kind of man who has never once worried about being wrong because he has always been the one writing the report. Beside Quillen, in full Army Scout uniform, was Daco Ashwoman. Tobias had seen trackers before. Good ones. But the way Daco moved his eyes across the ground as they rode in, the way he pulled up short near the riverbank and studied the dirt without even dismounting, that was not a soldier following orders. That was a man who could read the land the way most men read a newspaper. Slow, deliberate, missing nothing. Daco saw the wagon tracks. He saw the blood in the dirt near the fence line, and his jaw tightened in a way that said he already knew. Tobias stepped out onto the porch before they reached the door. Quillen did the talking, kept it short and official. Apache fugitive, wanted for the murder of a deputy. Anyone harboring her, he said, would be charged with obstructing a federal warrant. He smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that has a threat folded inside it. Tobias said he had not seen anyone. And that was when Daco looked at him. Not at the barn, not at the house, at the yellow bandana around Tobias's neck. There was a single black hair caught in the knot. For a second, the whole porch went quiet enough to hear the flies. Both men knew it. Neither one said a word. What happens when two stubborn men are standing 3 feet apart, and they both know the other one is lying? Daco rode out with Quillen that evening, but he came back alone 2 hours later. At least, he looked alone. Tobias glanced past him into the dark and saw nothing. That bothered him more than seeing a rifle would have. He did not knock. He just stood at the door of the barn with his hat in his hand, and Tobias knew that whatever was about to happen, it was not going to be simple. Elena came out from the water cellar on her own. She had heard the horse. She already knew who it was. Brother and sister stood 10 feet apart in the lamplight, and neither one spoke for a long moment. There was too much to say and no good place to start. That is how it is sometimes with people who love each other and have been put on opposite sides of something neither one of them chose. Daco finally said he needed to bring her in, that there was no other way. Elena did not flinch. She told him to follow her to the river first. Just look at one thing, then he could decide. Daco looked at her like he wanted to believe her and hated himself for wanting it. Tobias grabbed the shovel. The three of them rode to the Rio Bonito bend in the dark, quiet as people who understand that sound travels at night. Elena guided them to the spot marked on the map. The ground there looked ordinary enough. Packed dirt, a few rocks placed a little too deliberately, the kind of thing you would only notice if you were looking for it. The first shovel bite sounded too loud in the dark. Even the horses stopped shifting, as if every living thing near that bend knew the ground was about to give up a secret. Tobias started digging. It did not take long. 2 feet down, wrapped in canvas, was a woman's bracelet, beaded. Blue and white, the other half of the broken one from the bundle. Beneath the canvas, a small strip of child's cloth showed through the dirt, faded but still tied with the same blue and white beads. And beside it, a piece of cloth that had nothing to do with Elena, nothing to do with Daco, but had everything to do with where a certain deputy had been the night 3 Mescalero families stopped being seen. Daco picked up that bracelet and held it in his palm. His face did not change, but his breathing did. For the first time that night, Daco looked less like a scout and more like a brother. That was when Quillen stepped out of the dark. He had 2 men with him, both armed, and he had positioned himself on the highest side of the bank so the firelight was in their eyes and not his. He had been following Daco the whole time, banking on exactly this. He told Daco to take Elena and get on his horse. Said a few beads and scraps dug out of Apache ground would prove nothing in a federal court, not without a white witness willing to swear to it. He was still talking when Elena said, quietly and plainly, "He put your markings at the scene, Daco. He has been using you like a hunting dog." Quillen went for his gun. Tobias moved faster than a man his size had any right to. He swung the shovel hard and caught Quillen's wrist before the pistol cleared the holster. Then he dropped his shoulder and drove into him like a man who learned to fight in places where there were no rules and no referees. Quillen went down into the mud. The second gunman came around the rock and Tobias wrapped the reins around the man's ankles and pulled. And that was the end of that conversation. The third man looked at Daco. Daco had his rifle up. It was not pointed at Elena. Quillen grabbed his wounded hand, got to his horse, and disappeared into the darkness. But before he did, he turned back and shouted that Tobias Morrow was harboring a federal fugitive, and that Fort Stanton would hear a very different version of this story by morning. He was not wrong about that last part, and that is exactly what made the morning so dangerous. Before we follow that dust back to Tobias's porch, take one moment. If you believe stories like this still deserve to be told, stories where the truth gets buried, but someone keeps digging, subscribe and stay with us. The worst part of this night is not over yet. They did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Quillen was still out there. The evidence was in their hands, but not in front of a judge. And the sun was going to come up whether they were ready for it or not. Daco sat by the fire that night and did not say much. He took off his scout jacket sometime around midnight and folded it over his knee, slow and deliberate, like a man setting down something that had gotten too heavy to carry. He was not angry at every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. He was angry at himself for not seeing sooner how easily that uniform could be used by the wrong man. That is a quieter kind of anger, and it stays longer. He told Tobias he knew an officer at Fort Stanton, a man who still cared about doing things the right way. He would ride at first light and put the evidence in front of him directly. No reports filed through Quillen. No chain of command that Quillen could reach. It was the best plan they had, which meant it was also fragile as glass. Daco rode out before dawn, carrying the bundle under his coat and saying nothing more than that he would be back if the officer listened. Elena stayed at the ranch to rest her shoulder. She did not ask permission. She just stayed, the way a person stays when they have finally found a place that does not immediately feel like a trap. The small things happened the way small things do when people do not know what else to do with themselves. Tobias left his yellow bandana on the table near her. She used it to rewrap her shoulder, then handed it back. He shook his head and told her to keep it. She looked at it for a moment, then folded it carefully and set it beside her. That evening she found a tear along his shirt sleeve and mended it without being asked. He set his rifle by the door that night, but he did not lock her room. In the morning, Elena stood on the porch, watching Rio Bonito catch the early light. Tobias came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. She said, "Are you afraid?" He thought about it honestly. Then he said, "I have been afraid plenty of times. Never seemed to help much." She almost smiled. Almost. For one quiet second, it looked like the world might let 2 tired people breathe. Then the dust came up from the Fort Stanton road. Not one rider, a full column of cavalry. And riding at the front, straight-backed and unhurried as always, was Quillen. This time he was holding papers, official papers, with a real seal on them. Daco was not with them, and that told Tobias something had gone wrong before the papers ever reached the porch. Quillen had spent the night doing what corrupt men do best. He had made it legal. Watching Daco fold that scout jacket by the fire stuck with me more than the gunfight ever did. Because the hardest thing in this story wasn't the shooting. It wasn't Quillen's lies. It wasn't even those shallow graves along the Rio Bonito. It was a man getting trapped between 2 worlds and finding out neither one was clean enough to save him. That's the part history doesn't always put on the posters. The U.S. Army used Apache scouts for years, sometimes sending them after other Apache bands. Folks behind desks called it strategy. Maybe it was. But I've lived long enough to know powerful men love making somebody else carry the ugly part of their plan. And that brings us right back to Elena, those water right papers, and the families being pushed off land they had every reason to call home. Funny thing about land, the men trying to take it almost never call it stealing. They call it progress. They call it development. They call it management. Hell, give a thief a good enough lawyer and he'll call robbery policy. We still play that game today. Different century. Different suits. Same old damn song. Water, land, resources. Somebody with power says a sacrifice has to be made, and somehow the sacrifice is always somebody else's home, somebody else's graveyard, somebody else's children learning to pack before they learn to belong. Now, I ain't saying every government man is crooked and every document is a lie. But when people start getting pushed off the ground where their families are buried, I stop listening to speeches and start watching who gets paid. Because a man can serve orders for a while. He can serve his conscience for a while. But sooner or later, one of them is going to ask for blood. And when that day comes, what side do you think your soul will be standing on?